Welcome back to that 90s pod. Today, we're diving deep into a song that still to this day sends shivers down my spine.
Okay.
Alanis Morissette's You Oughta Know.
Ooh, yeah.
If you're vibing with that 90s pod. And you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button and share the sonic love with your friends.
It is wild to think that even in 2025, this song still has the power to evoke such visceral reactions.
Yeah.
What do you think it is about You Oughta Know that continues to resonate with listeners even decades after its release?
I think for me, it's the raw honesty. 1995 was peak grunge.
Right.
Everyone was craving authenticity, and here comes Alanis, ditching her old pop sound for something so much more feral.
Yeah.
Like a sonic punch to the gut.
It's true. The music landscape was definitely primed for that kind of shift. I think grunge had really thrown open the doors for expressing raw emotion.
Yeah.
Bands like Nirvana and Pearl Jam were tapping into a deep well of angst and vulnerability.
Yeah.
And Alanis, in her own way, channeled that same energy, but with a distinctly female perspective.
Yeah, and that's what made it so groundbreaking. This wasn't your typical breakup song. Yeah. It was a full-on sonic exorcism of rage and betrayal. It wasn't about wallowing in sadness. It was about calling out the BS and owning your anger.
Right. Think about the sonic landscape of pop music. Back then, a lot of it was very polished, very safe.
Yeah.
And then You Oughta Know explodes onto the scene with these jagged guitar riffs.
Yeah.
Courtesy of Dave Navarro.
Wait.
From Red Hot Chili Peppers, no less.
Dave Navarro played on this track.
Oh, yeah. His contribution is huge.
Wow.
He adds this layer of grittiness that perfectly underscores Alanis's vocal intensity. It's not just her voice that's cutting. The music itself has this sharp edge to it.
Okay, mind blown. I always knew that guitar part was killer. But knowing that it's Navarro takes it to a whole new level.
Right.
But let's go back to the lyrics for a second. There's one line that always gets me.
Okay.
And every time I scratch my nails down someone else's back, I hope you feel it. Like, wow. Talk about making your presence known.
That line is pure fire. And it's a perfect example of how Alanis challenged societal expectations of how women should express heartbreak. There's a boldness, a refusal to play the victim that resonated deeply, especially with women who were tired of being told to be quiet and demure.
It was like she gave a whole generation permission to unleash their inner rock goddess.
Exactly. It's not just about anger, though. There's also this vulnerability, this rawness that shines through. Think about the line, "Is she perverted like me? Would she go down on you in a theater?" It's so intimate, so unexpected.
Yeah.
And it breaks down all these taboos about female sexuality.
It's like she's saying, I'm not ashamed of my desires, my anger, any of it. It's incredibly empowering.
Right.
And speaking of empowerment, this song became a straight-up anthem for so many people, especially young women. It was like a rallying cry for anyone who had ever been underestimated or silenced.
It tapped into a cultural shift that was already happening, this yearning for authenticity and a rejection of fake manufactured emotions. But You Oughta Know took it a step further. It provided a blueprint for owning your narrative, for expressing the full spectrum of human emotions, even the messy ones. And it wasn't just about romantic relationships, This song had a ripple effect that extended way beyond heartbreak.
Right.
It tapped into this broader cultural conversation about mental health, about the need to destigmatize emotions like anger and frustration.
It's true. Back then, there was so much pressure, especially on women, to be nice and pleasant, to suppress anything that might be perceived as negative. It blew those expectations out of the water.
Absolutely, and that's why it became such a cultural touchstone. It wasn't just a song, it was a statement. It gave a voice to experiences that had been silenced for far too long.
It's funny because hearing you talk about it now, I'm realizing just how much this song impacted me personally. I remember being in high school when it came out, going through my own messy breakup and feeling like Alanis was speaking directly to my soul.
That feeling of recognition of someone finally understanding what you're going through, that's the magic of music. And it's what makes You Oughta Know so timeless.
Totally. And think about the artists who came after Alanis. Like, you can draw a direct line from her to someone like Taylor Swift, who's also known for channeling her personal experiences into these confessional anthems.
Absolutely. Alanis paved the way for a whole generation of artists, especially women who weren't afraid to be vulnerable, to be angry, to be messy. She showed them that it was okay to express the full spectrum of human emotions, even the ones that society might deem unladylike.
And it's not just about the lyrics, right? Musically, You Oughta Know was a departure from a lot of the pop music that was popular at the time.
It was a sonic earthquake. It took elements of grunge, alternative rock, even a bit of pop sensibility. and blended them into this explosive, unforgettable sound.
And let's not forget that music video.
Oh,
The close-ups on Alanis's face, the raw energy, the sweat. It was so visceral, so in your face. It perfectly captured the intensity of the song.
that video was a game changer. It helped solidify the song's iconic status and contributed to its cultural impact.
Speaking of impact, before we go any deeper, we want to give a shout out to all our amazing listeners. If you're digging this deep dive into You Oughta Know, make sure to hit that subscribe button and share the 90s love with your friends. Now let's get back to Alanis and her legacy.
You Oughta Know wasn't just a hit song, it was a cultural phenomenon. It sparked conversations, challenged norms, and most importantly, it empowered a generation to embrace their authentic selves.
And that's a legacy that continues to resonate today. We see it in the music of artists like Billie Eilish, Olivia Rodrigo, and so many others who are carrying the torch of raw, honest expression.
It's amazing to think how one song released nearly 30 years ago can still have such a powerful impact, and it all goes back to that fearless vulnerability that Alanis brought to the table.
Totally. You Oughta Know. It wasn't just a breakup song. It was a declaration of independence.
And that's a message that will never go out of style.
You know, it's incredible how a song can become so much bigger than itself.
Yeah.
You Oughta Know.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a track on an album. It became this cultural touchstone,
Right.
a symbol of female empowerment.
And it's interesting to think about the context of the music industry back then, Female artists were often expected to fit into very specific molds. The innocent ingenue,
Right.
the heartbroken balladeer. Alanis shattered those expectations.
She was unapologetically angry, vulnerable, and desired all at the same time. It was like she gave other women in music permission to do the same, to express their full selves without censorship.
Think about the wave of female artists who followed in her wake. Fiona Apple, Shirley Manson of Garbage, even someone like Lizzo today. They all tap into that same energy of owning their narratives and refusing to be put in a box.
It's about breaking free from those constraints and embracing authenticity, something that's even more relevant now in the age of social media, where there's so much pressure to present a perfectly curated version of yourself.
You Oughta Know was a raw and unfiltered reminder that it's okay to be messy complicated. And yes, even a little bit angry.
It was a rallying cry for authenticity. In a world that often tries to smooth out the edges,
Right.
and that message, that spirit of defiant self-expression, that's what continues to resonate with listeners even today.
Absolutely. It's a song that will be debated, analyzed, and celebrated for generations to come. And it all goes back to that fearless vulnerability that Alanis brought to the world in 1995.
Well said. And on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive into You Oughta Know. We hope you enjoyed this trip back to the 90s and maybe even rediscovered this iconic anthem. As always, thanks for tuning into that 90s pod. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out on our next deep dive. We'll catch you in the next episode.